The focus of this lesson was on irregular past tense verbs. I chose this as the focus for this lesson because there were two ELL students in the class that were repeatedly trying to form the past tense out of irregular verbs by adding the ed. So an example of some language that I had heard them using in the past week was I putted the stapler on the desk, or I getted a good grade on the spelling test. The objectives of this lesson were twofold. The first was that students would be able to state that some verbs are irregular because the past tense is not formed by adding ed. This came from the Common Core standard that students should be able to form and use the past tense of frequently occurring irregular verbs. The assessment was that after we had looked at and noticed some patterns between verbs in a text, I asked the students to summarize the difference between the regular and irregular verbs. The second objective was for students to be able to accurately use target verbs in the past and present tense with the support of sentence stems, both orally and in writing. This came from the Common Core standards to use verbs to convey a sense of time, as well as the standard to use words and phrases acquired through reading and being read to. And they were read a text in this lesson. There were two assessments. The first, it comes about halfway through when we do a comprehension check to make sure that students are accurately using the words in meaningful sentences with the support of those sentence stems. And then a final assessment where students are using the target vocabulary in their writing. The students were two ELLs. Their native language was Arabic. They had both been in the United States for 2 years. They were in grade 5 at Ba Elementary, and their WIDA levels were 2 and 3. So just as a brief reminder, these students were able to engage in non-academic conversations, but they were struggling with grammar, and they were struggling with some of that more sophisticated academic vocabulary. And reading as well was still a challenge. They were not reading at grade level. The text that I chose to use for this lesson is Diary of a Wombat. I chose this text because it had a good variety of regular and irregular past tense verbs used in context, and there wasn't too much text and the words were accessible to these students. The first part of the lesson was just to read the book aloud and make sure that the students were understanding the story as well as the target verbs through acting out, through asking for synonyms. The second part of the lesson, after we had read aloud the book, was to go back and identify the past tense verbs. So I had marked with the pages with sticky notes that I thought had verbs that would be useful for this lesson. And the way that we identified them is I would turn to the page and ask, what did he do? Each time that student would identify a verb that showed what he was doing, I would have them write it on a strip of paper that was large enough to be seen from the whiteboard. If the students had identified an irregular verb, I would give them a red piece of paper, and if they had identified a regular verb, I gave them an orange piece of paper. But at this point, we weren't talking about any differences between those two types of verbs. After they had written all the verbs that I had identified in the text, we pasted them on the board, putting the red ones in one group and the orange ones in another group. After that, I asked them to match the past tense verbs with their equivalents in the present tense, although at this point we were not talking about any differences between them. So what I did is I had pre-written the present tense form of the words on slips of paper in matching colors, and I would give them the slip and say, where do you think this goes? And they were able to match the past tense with the present tense. After that, I asked them to look for patterns, and as they identified patterns, I would post some reminders on the board of those patterns. All the verbs in the left column were present tense, which they noticed, and you can see in the green that I had prepared definition of the present tense verbs as verb that we use to talk about the everyday, the sometimes, or never. They also added I'm going to as another way we would use these verbs. And they also added the correct grammatical term of present. I wasn't expecting them to do that, so we actually added that together. They also noticed that all of the verbs in the right column were past tense, which the definition that I had identified was words we would use to talk about yesterday or things that were finished. Again, they came up with that grammatical term, which we created and posted on the board. They also noticed that all the past tense verbs in orange, which are on the bottom half of the screen, ended in ed, but none of the past tense verbs in red ended in ed. So that was an opportunity for us to talk about regular and irregular verbs. And it was at this point, after we had discussed and really fleshed out their noticings, that I asked them to discuss what was the difference between regular and irregular verbs. And I had an opportunity for my first assessment to see if they understood the difference between these two categories of verbs. And just to emphasize that the points in red are what they added to the conversation, what I had not anticipated. At this point, we did our check for understanding, which was to make sure that they were able to use these words. I provided them sentence stems. You can see every day, sometimes, blank, never, I'm going to, which they added, and yesterday, last week, yesterday, earlier today. And first they matched those sentence stems to the verbs that they would use them with, so the verbs on the right or the verbs on the left. Then one student would come and point to a verb, and the other student would have to create a sentence. And they had the option to draw from the sentence stems if they liked, and they did draw from the sentence stems. And both students were able to accurately use the words. It was about at this point in the lesson that the student said to me, "This is stupid, we already know these words. Why are we spending time working on them?" And so I, at this moment, said, well, these are things that I heard you saying last week. And I gave them the examples that I gave at the beginning of this presentation. I putted the stapler, I getted, and then at that point, once they had realized that this was something that they were struggling with and that they weren't always using correctly, they became a lot more invested in the lesson, and they started asking about several other verbs and were they regular or were they irregular. The final part of this lesson was the assessment. So each student made their own diary using the Diary of a Wombat as a mentor text. You can see that the student on the left-hand side, that's very colorful, she was the level 3 student, and the student who has a white background was the level 2 student. And you can see that they did very different things with the task. The first thing I asked them to do was to fold their paper in 4, come up with a title, and then to write 3 sentences about what their animal did. You can see that they had, I first asked them, what verbs do you think we will use, the verbs on the right or the verbs on the left, and why? And they all said we will use the verbs on the right because these things are finished, they've already happened. After they wrote the text, we made a key for regular and irregular verbs, which you can see circled, and then they marked with stars which verbs were irregular and which verbs were regular. In terms of what went well, the language was used in context, and so we didn't have to stop and talk about meaning. The directions were pretty clear and explicit. I gave directions at all points, both orally and in writing, and gave them examples. The students were pretty engaged. They enjoyed the read aloud. They enjoyed the writing activity, and they thought it was fun to paste the verbs on the board and talk about them, and especially after we talked about the need to learn those verbs. Areas for improvement. I wish I had thought more about using the correct grammatical language. I think that if I had done this, it would have helped them to connect to their prior knowledge that they've already had about English grammar as well as in the future. So we were able to make those strips that said past and present, but that's an important thing for me to remember as I'm lesson planning, is that these students really do benefit from using those grammar terms. The second thing I would like to improve is to give students the opportunity to add verbs to the word wall. They were pretty excited to learn about verbs that they already knew and try and figure out if they were regular or irregular. Also creating relevancy. It wasn't until later in the lesson that I told them why we were working on this and cited some of the language I had heard them using. I wish I had fronted that a little bit more so that they could have been excited about the practicality of this lesson a little bit early. And one area for improvement that I'm still not really sure about, so I would like to try it, is that we didn't pause to find any patterns until we had pasted both the past and the present tense on the board. And the reason that I did that is I wanted them to notice that the ED was being added on to something. But I would be curious to try it just finding the patterns between the past tense verbs, noticing, oh, some of these end in ED and some of them don't, and then adding the present tense verbs, and then having them notice more patterns. So that would be something that I might want to try next time. If I were able to kind of situate this within a larger unit of study, I would do this at a point where the students did have a pretty big vocabulary to draw from and knew all these verbs and were able to use them, even if they weren't always conjugating them accurately. And I would probably do this as one of the first of our explicit verb tense lessons, and then we would move on to discuss other tenses. So this could be kind of a jumping off point.